Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of IPA Encounters with Professor Doug Stokes. Doug is the Director of Strategy and Security Institute at the University of Exeter. Our topic for discussion today is the war on our culture and how to win it. Doug is a Senior Advisor at the Legatum Institute and an Advisory Council member of the Free Speech Union. He also recently authored a significant paper on why Canada should join AUKUS that was endorsed by IPA Distinguished Fellow, of course, Tony Abbott. Doug's writing has appeared in newspapers and journals around the world, and to Australian audiences, he's known well from a previous conversation with John Anderson. Doug is the author of an outstanding book published last year, Against Decolonisation, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. The book was endorsed by a good friend of the IPA and a previous guest on IPA Encounters, Professor Robert Toombs of the University of Cambridge. And let me just read out Robert's endorsement of the book. Doug Stokes' book forensically dissects the ideas and practices concerning race, equality, identity and grievance, which are having such an explosive impact on our intellectual and cultural life. Whatever one's sentiments and sympathies, this is a concise and lucid guide to what lies behind the culture war. Doug, thank you for being with us on IPA Encounters.
Absolute pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
Can I begin by taking the last part of Robert Toombs's endorsement? He talks about what lies behind the culture war. Can I ask you, what does lie behind the culture war we seem to be engulfed in at the moment?
I think there's various factors. There's, on the one hand, I think a lot of what we call woke is emergent from a much deeper philosophical transformation of Western civilization and Western culture. And this really emerged as a reaction against the West, but also against elements of social, scientific and humanities theory in the 1960s. So you've heard of the New Left, ultimately, which kind of emerged in Western culture in the late 1960s. And to sort of cut to the chase for your listeners and your watchers, the main element, the philosophical element underlying the culture wars is what I call social constructivism and the emergence of social constructivism. So if we think about the values at the heart of Western civilization, hitherto there'd been, for example, a belief in reality, a belief in ontological primacy, i.e. we come to understand the world as it is. That's never perfect. That's never a perfect understanding, but nonetheless, scientific knowledge and this process of uncovering is based upon something that is real, something that exists independently of our consciousness, and our consciousness and our understanding of this is a process of gradual unfolding. So Western civilization, science, etc., places an emphasis on ontological reality, what exists.
And reason is a big part of that. And rationality.
Well, exactly. So essentially, the way in which you come to understand the world as it exists is through a process of rational adjudication. And rational adjudication, by its very nature, rests on the assumption that there are better ways of understanding the world. So we may hitherto have understood the volcanoes as the anger of the gods, but we now know, for example, that these are the tectonic movements in the plates of the earth. We may believe that we can fly, but nonetheless, because of ontological reality exists independently of our understanding of it. If I jump out of this window here, I'm going to hit the deck and minimally break my back.
Even if I somehow think I am a bird?
You're welcome to think that you're a bird, but because of ontological reality, because of the primacy of ontology, what actually exists, no matter how much you believe that you're a bird, you'll never ultimately be a bird because of this. So the philosophical elements that have really transformed that understanding is what we can call social constructivism. And social constructivism says that there is no such thing as reality. There's no such thing as a world out there. In fact, everything is ultimately about understanding and interpretations of the world as it exists. And so our interpretations of the world are ultimately what gives meaning to the world. And also, these understandings of the world, how we understand the world, are fundamentally imbued with power relations. So if I understand the world in a certain type of way, it restructures power relationships in ways in which it approximates to a kind of oppressor-oppressed dyad. So if we unpack some of the thinkers, so Michel Foucault, for example, talks about this idea of discourses and epistemes. And he says that there are sort of different understandings of the world, ultimately socially construct the world. And these social constructions are invariably quite oppressive. So the way we understand the world is imbued with power. And Jacques Derrida talks about Western philosophy is characterized by this binary system of philosophy, where you have two elements of thought at the heart, a meta-philosophical framework: man, woman, white, black, reason, unreason. And so this dyad is always in a state of tension and hierarchy. So people like Foucault and Derrida, and then you get the post-colonial thinkers, people like Ibn Said, who applied these ideas, these postmodern and post-structuralist ideas of the primacy of interpretation, the fundamental power relationships inherent to these interpretations, and this binary dyad system. He applied post-colonial thinking to the history of the West. And he said, ultimately, the history of the West was an imperial project, a colonial project, but it was primarily about a discursive project too, an interpretive project, whereby as the West colonized, it also imposed thought systems and ways of being and ways of thinking on these oppressed groups. And therefore, when you take that package together, what you have is the rejection of ontology, the rejection of rational adjudication, and the rejection of science, and then an emphasis on the political and moral power of interpretation and the primacy of interpretation, and to point out interpretation is fundamentally a contingent act. If I can say to you, John, well, you say the world is structured in this way, but that's actually just your interpretation, and you're imposing your interpretation on me, and therefore you're the oppressor. And then when you sort of take this package together, you can begin to then understand the philosophical meta-value framework that we see now in Western politics of intersectionalism, where you have the kind of a pyramid of hierarchy and identity. If the world doesn't exist, if the world is simply about a social struggle over different interpretations of endless, it's like a Nietzschean power struggle, an endless struggle of power of interpretations. And because the white heterosexual men have run the world, they've imposed their interpretations on the world itself. So the political moment is to both point out the contingency of social understanding, and by pointing out the contingency of social understanding and rejecting truth, you kind of throw everything into the air, and it becomes radically contingent. It's like a very playful politics, but very, very dangerous politics. And there are distinctions between that and Marxism. If you want to unpack that, we can do that. But that's, broadly speaking, the kind of framework.
That's a wonderful analysis, and there's so much to it. If I can then ask you some questions flowing from that. What gave rise to this? What gave rise to these fairly once esoteric ideas, which you have talked about, developed in the petri dishes of higher education, which have now spread through society, after we had a process of the Industrial Revolution that improved humankind's material condition, the Enlightenment, we had the spread of democracy, we had Western civilization as a process of improvement. What gave rise to this rejection and this almost nihilism of a system that had been reasonably successful and was improving?
Well, I think there are multiple ways you could look at it. I think one of the ways you could look at it would be, in some senses, the success of capitalism. and the success of liberal democracies. I mean, anybody that can.
So the success had the seeds of its own defeat or its own questioning.
Well, there's the obvious point that if you exist in a society where you have to struggle each day just to get enough calories into your stomach, or the water, to walk miles for water, or all these kind of things. These kinds of debates about self-definition and becoming who you are, and these kinds of highly indulgent debates. I mean, it's redolent of the late Roman Empire. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, but you've got these often highly privileged Roman aristocratic elites sitting around, engaging in these kind of identity politics and self-definition, and then living on the back of this thing. So I think on one level, and if you look at the background, a lot of the people that are saying this stuff and come out with these ideas, they invariably exist in highly privileged bubbles, often public sector bubbles as well, where they're protected ultimately from reality. I think you can only sustain these types of things when you're protected from reality. So whether that's through a general economic dispensation of the wealth of the West, ultimately, and the success of capitalism and liberal democracy. So it's either that, or you exist as a kind of not a parasite, too strong a word, but you exist in a kind of a public sector bubble on the campus, for example. I mean, that's a classic example of this, where ultimately your ideas don't have to intersect with reality, and so there's that, and then on a kind of, that's a kind of banal analysis, but then there's a sort of a philosophical and theoretical analysis is also because of the developments in left social theory. So the interesting thing here is a lot of conservatives and classical liberals they tend to trace wokery from the antecedents of Marxism. And I would say that in many senses, woke politics and identity politics is as catastrophic for Marxist or socioeconomic critiques of capitalism, at least, class politics, as it is for Western civilization.
Could you talk a bit about why that is? Because you put your finger on something important, and in the book, as you were just discussing, you powerfully demonstrate how the views of the privileged elite in higher education in the UK do not match the reality of the experience for minority groups. They do not match the reality of the real diversity that exists in higher education. You talk about that very, very powerfully in your work. But to come back to the origins of woke, so often it is described as a outlet of Marxism or a development of Marxism, but you don't quite have that view. How would you unpack woke and its meaning, and then what it means for the left?
Well, I think that in many ways, the what I described earlier on, social constructivism, post-structuralism, postmodern, actually emerged as a deep critique of Marxism. So if you look at left social theory, I can go down the rabbit hole if you want on this, but left social theory post-war, especially during the 1950s, most of it came out from France. Derrida, Foucault, Edward Said. There's a francophone influence, very, very strong influence. But those thinkers in turn were reactive against 1950s Marxism, which became very doctrinaire. And in particular, I'm thinking about somebody called Louis Althusser, who talked about the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus. But he was very much a sort of structural Marxist, very doctrinaire, very class orientated, about state power. So a lot of the post-structuralist and post-modernist thinkers, they explicitly rejected that hierarchical notion of power, a ruling class that exercises power through the repressive state and also ideology, the media. That you've heard, this idea of Rupert Murdoch controls everybody's brains, blah 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 blah. They explicitly reject that idea, and for a much more playful notion of power. So they reject a hierarchic notion of power for a more playful notion of power, where power is ultimately, it circulates through forms of knowledge. But also they explicitly also reject a socio-economic critique of capitalism. So in terms of their oppression matrix, where they put the levels of oppression, it isn't about class per se and the structural conditions of capitalism as a mode of production. They explicitly reject that. They argue that ultimately oppression is more commensurate with an intersectional identity matrix. So essentially, if social life is about self-definition and interpretation, and knowledge is playful within these epistemes and discourses, then oppression is far more predicated around identity, sexuality, gender, race, and all of these things, by the way, are seen as social constructs. So that should now begin to also, you should see now how you can begin to see how this has escaped the Petri dish. Gender as a social construct has escaped the Petri dish of the campus, and is now like the COVID is now spread more through society, not because people explicitly hold these philosophical viewpoints, but because they like any sort of theoretical or philosophical system, it just percolates and becomes a kind of meta framework for social understanding. So that's how we see then these ideas of social constructivism have escaped the Petri dish of the campus. Gender, self-definition, whiteness, these kind of concepts are explicitly related to this process.
Is woke then the popularisation of these philosophical concepts, or is woke something different? And woke means a variety of things in a variety of contexts.
I think woke, if understood ultimately as a kind of pejorative term for a deeper intersectional theory, which is what it really is, and the privileging of alleged minority groups that are in an endless process of oppression. I think we can understand woke in that sense. So it has that cultural purchase, but also woke politics is also about a power play on the part of technocratic and bureaucratic elites, both at the national and the supranational level. And I think that's what, if you want to scratch away the surface, that's the value of woke as an ideology. Ultimately, this is about a process of corralling victim groups into endless, and that's ultimately what left-wing politics needs, right? It needs endless victims. So go back to the point we were talking about earlier on. If we look at the material nature of modern life in the West, on a material basis, in terms of material plenty and relative poverty, even globally, you look at the global stats on poverty, child mortality, gender equality, all these things. We've never really lived in a better or more progressive dispensation, really. So essentially, in some senses, then woke politics for me is about a new form of technocratic ideology, corporate technocratic ideology, to structure news or to ultimately to maintain forms of technocratic rule, often one step removed and or completely outside the context of democratic control. That's for me what politics is about.
You've spoken about this in the context of higher education as administrators and diversity consultants have a bigger role. And then you've spoken about the professional managerial class using the ideology of woke, or however defined, to maintain power. Can you talk a little bit about that professional managerial class, and then how that class seems to have escaped democratic control?
Well, the professional managerial class is a term, interestingly, both used by classical liberals and conservatives, but also the old school Marxist left. So there's a very interesting Marxist thinker called Catherine Hugh, who I think is based at a higher education institution in the States. She's done some great work on this too. So, Burnham, Michael Lind, these kind of thinkers have really drawn and developed this literature on this professional managerial class. And what they ultimately argue is that the future in the post-war international system, we had capitalism and communism, so we had a kind of a Cold War process, but consistent throughout that process and in the post-Cold War period, in the West at least, is the continuity of a very powerful technocratic, bureaucratic class that run both private but mainly public sector institutions. And so this professional managerial class, with the way it operates, is through a moral economy of risk. So they define the risk. They say there's this risk here, and we therefore have to keep you safe. But the way we keep you safe is you give us power and don't question our power, and then we'll impose sets of regulations and governance structures and forms of law, etc., that then lock in both our hierarchic power, but also these new forms of regulatory governance. So that's the argument about the professional managerial class. So what I would say, and what others have said too, is one of the ways in which often left-wing politics works is it works through an endless process of moral panic. You have to generate endless moral panics, usually around forms of ism, so there's sexism, racism, sexism. Wherever you look, there's these endless forms of oppression. So you have to give these public sector bodies, invariably public sector bodies, these forms of power to de-risk or to regulate risk out of social life. So it's about ultimately a form, and whenever you look at any technocracy or bureaucracy, if there's ever a problem, it's ultimately, what's the solution? You grow the bureaucracy, you just grow the bureaucracy, and you give us more power to regulate out of existence.
And you give more power to the experts. So how have they escaped democratic control and democratic accountability? Because again, you talk powerfully about the separation of interest, of values, of principles between that small technocratic elite and most of the public.
Well, there are various mechanisms in the UK, for example. This is why Tony Blair was a strategic genius. I mean, incredible statesperson, absolutely incredible. But one of the big innovations that Blair did was he sort of deepened what was called the quango. The quangos, are quasi-autonomous non-governmental agencies. And these are ultimately one step removed from government, one step removed from parliament, which run things. So they have their own budgets, they have their own governance structure. In the final instance, they're supposed to be accountable to ministers, but they very rarely are. And given ministerial churn, they're effectively, they run the country. So one example would be NHS England, National Health. So the National Health Service in the UK is I think it's the world's 5th largest employer. It's got 2 million employees. It's got like 25% of the entire tax budget goes to the National Health Service. And like any big public sector, I mean, this isn't me bashing on that national or the people that work in it, but any public sector, ultimately, where's the Hayekian logic for error correction? In the private sector, in an ideal world, you have a competitive marketplace and people ultimately, on a social, economic level, you aggregate social demand through people vote with their wallet. In the public sector, you have these kind of things. So the NHS England is a quango, runs the entire National Health Service in the UK. It's got a budget, I think it's like £150 billion a year. It's ridiculous amounts of money. That's just one instance. So we have lots and lots of these quangos. What Liz Truss came out recently and spoke about the blob, and she was sort of attacked for it. But I think any future administration, especially a Conservative administration, has got to think very seriously about how it reforms the quango system in the UK, but more broadly, where you have very, very powerful bodies that set the governance structures and the regulatory structures that govern life.
And that are largely outside of the democratic process.
Yeah, and not just that, often antithetical to the democratic process. So I mean, there's various high points for this, but I mean, so you've got that. Then you've got the civil service. You've got an incredibly large civil service that grew even more during the COVID lockdown period, which again, it has its own expressed political opinions. They're supposed to be impartial, but that they're clearly not. I mean, there's been huge scandals recently in relation to the Home Office, etc. So you've got, so on the domestic level, you've got the government, people vote the government in power, but then you've got what we could call the blob, the quango and the civil service blob, which ultimately has their own path dependency and their own worldview and their own social regulatory and governance power. So you've got ministers in the highest states of the land, the Home Office, and they're out of power, Suella Braverman, and they're moaning about the fact they couldn't get anything done. These are the ministers that the British people vote into power. They've voted the government, but then they hit this blob, and so I think my main problem with that is inefficiency, but also democratic accountability. If we consider ourselves to be Democrats, that's a massive issue. Because we've got people voting for the government on the basis of their manifesto, The government gets into power, and then through either inefficiency or whatever, or vested interest, cannot exercise or cannot execute the will of the British people. So that's at the national level. And if we've got some time, I can talk you. But then it's the supranational level, which it gets even more egregious. So you've got national bodies in the UK, but then as Australia is then also subject to supranational bodies. So, classic example of this was the WHO. You may have seen recently the WHO, World Health Organization, is talking about if it now declares a potential a global health emergency, like the coronavirus, the DG, the Director General of WHO, is potentially has the power to close down the global economy and to impose lockdowns on nation states.
On sovereign states, yes.
Sovereign state, and that's where we're headed. So you've got supranational forms of governance. Again, what's the accountability structures for these things? Who's voted for them? How do you and I how do we vote these people out of power? You see what I mean? So essentially you've got this massive technocratic governance, regulatory, supranational, domestic level forms of governance that have emerged that have created a fundamental disconnect between the will of the people and forms of ultimately executive, regulatory, and legal power. It's deeply problematic.
And then what I'd like to ask you about now is the consequences of that, because, and I'll talk about the left and the working class in a moment, and I'll ask you about that. But you write something very interesting against decolonisation, and you write, left-wing politics used to be based on upholding the rights, interests and instincts of the common man and woman, now seen as little more than explosions of vulgar populism which must be corralled, contained and neutered. So I'm going to ask you, Doug, a three-part question. When did the left stop caring about the working class? When did the left stop caring or paying lip service to democracy? And when did the left stop fighting for freedom of speech? Are they all connected, or are they different aspects of a bigger problem?
Well, in terms of the left, I think that a lot of left-wing politics now has transformed itself away from the working class. I mean, so there are new voting coalitions now, and I think that a lot of the left has moved away from that to this more sort of identity politics, woke type. So new coalitions are emerging on left-wing politics, but that's obviously deeply problematic, because then who speaks for the working class? Who speaks for ordinary people? And in particular, if we think about the emergence of globalization and this kind of globalism or globalization or the supranationalization that we're talking about, and in some senses, Brexit was a reaction against that. As we've seen these transformations in Western political economies, but also forms of political governance, often the negative effects of that have been borne by ordinary communities, and in particular working class communities. So what's the faith creed, or the creed of globalization, or this kind of sort of supranational forms of governance? What David Goodhart calls the anywheres versus the somewheres, the nation state, the community, sovereignty versus this open borders, flat world of globalization. So what does globalization ultimately offer? We increasingly offers the offshoring of jobs, the destruction of manufacturing and heavy industry, the mass immigration, which has both positive and negative effects on communities. But principally, most immigrants end up in often poor working class communities, which creates incredible stress on local services, schools, hospitals, etc. I was born in Hackney in East London, one of the most diverse parts of the world, and it's both a positive and negative story. But nonetheless, the main point is, it's not ultimately policy elites or elites, cultural and economic elites that are bearing both in particular the negative externalities of these policies. So what we call populism, or what the left tends to call populism, are reactions against these some of the most negative aspects of globalization and what has become now the new consensus in Western politics. Mass immigration, open borders, denigration of culture, repudiation of Western civilization, and increasingly a form of kind of race war, neo-racism against white people, which I would argue, and I argue in the book, is so dangerous.
Can you talk about that? Because you've had experience on continental Europe in war areas. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in other parts of the world and what we have to seek to avoid?
Well, I grew up in Hackney, East London, right, which is both the poorest and one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the world. And so I went from there. I spent some time. I spent some time in Bosnia just after the war, and I was in a town called Brčko, which is in northern Bosnia, which joined the two halves of Republika Srpska. And it was very heavy ethnic cleansing took place in that town. Before the war, it was about 80% mixed. After the war, it was 100% Serb. And then you had what was called the ZOS, the zone of separation, completely war-torn, crazy, war-torn, mines everywhere, destroyed. And on the other side were Bosnian Muslims. But one thing I really took away from that experience was the danger of identity politics and how quickly things can tip into dangerous and murderous violence when you pit groups against each other. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I've been sort of quite strong in this area, is to try to warn that we are playing with a dangerous fire when our institutions are pushing what I think is little more than a race war narrative against white people. I mean, the West ultimately is a very diverse place. The UK, at least, has been extraordinarily welcoming. It's opened its doors. That's been problematic in some instances. But broadly speaking, if you look at the data, you look at the achievements, you look at the educational, financial outcomes of minority groups, they're incredible, absolutely incredible. And we've sort of changed our laws, anti-discrimination. So it's incredible. So all this has been done, and yet we're now at a point in culture, and where we're told we've never been more racist, and we have to worship at the altar of the diversity, equity, inclusion. And you switch on the TV. There's not only is there completely out of whack demographic representation, which itself problematically rests on a kind of absolute false history, a complete garbled false history of the role of slavery, etc. We can talk about that if you wanted to. So you've got that going on, but then it's kind of pushing a race war narrative against white people, whiteness, white privilege, structural privileges. And white people are portrayed in the media as kind of...
And as you talk about white men, young white men, who are and from working class backgrounds, who are some of the most disadvantaged in the UK.
So not only are they the most disadvantaged in the UK, but essentially the woke history, the history it pushes, it's as if all white people are living on these massive estates, sipping, in the 18th century, was sipping pina coladas and being fanned, and so there's a collective guilt narrative, and that is so dangerous on so many different levels, because not only is it denigrating and destroying the goodwill of the British people and trust people are
and the dignity of work, the dignity of people who worked with their hands as well.
But also, if you look at the living conditions of ordinary Brits in the 1800s, for example, they were absolutely brutal. I mean, 16-hour days.
And you write brilliantly about that. You write about, 12, 13-year-old girls in the dark in the mine for 12 hours a day?
Yeah, so it's 7 days a week. So there's like various inquiries were done in the 1830s, like 9-year-old girls, kids, put into mine shafts in complete dark rooms just to open flaps to let some air in. They were in there for 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. So where we're at now is we've got invariably white liberals on the BBC and ethnic minority interlocutors, often drawn from very, very privileged backgrounds themselves and live very, very nice lives, telling white people as a collective that they owe reparations, they need to genuflect, they need to reflect on their privileges, etc. And the vast majority of people in this country come from brutal, hard, working class, very, very hard lives. So I just think that it's playing with fire. It's very dangerous to a kind of multiracial dispensation when you have a narrative of a race war narrative where white people are being told all the time that they're wrong, their history is rubbish, and they have to ultimately repudiate their own culture, their own history, and denigrate it endlessly. And then, as you allude to, within that, then there's also, it undercuts other very important elements of the social contract. So, the endless victimhood, and what does that do spiritually almost to the individual? The self-pity is an extraordinarily powerful but very, very dangerous emotional, spiritual drug that one can ingest. And it creates a sense of righteous anger, but it also justifies all kinds of very, very negative choices and ways of being. And again, that is not the way forward.
Can I then ask about the consequences of that, because your background is international strategy, geopolitics and international relations, and this is something of keen interest to the work of the IPA. You write, "A nation is not just a place, but a collective story that binds, unifies and links the past with the present to map a future." Can you talk about the consequences of what you've been describing for our national story, and then what does it mean for nation states in an environment that is becoming increasingly challenging and uncertain against those who would challenge the West?
Well, that's an incredible question. I mean, it ultimately speaks to one of the reasons I wrote the book also was a lot of these debates now are very much based on a settlement, a post-war settlement that is under incredible change and flux. And if you think about it, they're almost still dining out. And I think this is why I think the public sector institutions and universities haven't quite realised the bigger structural changes that are taking place in the world. They're still dining out because they're very, very protected in that space. But the ideas that they're pumping out are completely out of whack structurally with what's actually happening in world politics. But so they're based ultimately on a fairly successful form of globalization. But this is the deepest irony here. Many of the woke ideas are also based on American hegemony and an international system, an international economic order, a globalized order that's underpinned by American hegemony. In terms of it solves a lot of the collective action problems, a lot of the global economic problems that nation states individually would have to deal with, which would then pull huge amounts of resources away from the public sector.
And you make that point very well. You write about the American taxpayer underwriting the European welfare state.
Well, that's exactly what happened. That's partly why you see so much hostility to NATO. And it isn't just Trump. That's been there for a very long time, because the bare bones structural reality of where we're at is NATO, which is ultimately, it's absent the Americans, it doesn't exist. The American security guarantee. So a European security, so you've got very rich, very strong, big welfare states like Germany, for example, and Germany is the leader in the EU, and they posit this idea of what they've talked about, this thing called normative Europe for decades. And they cast Europe as this normative actor. So the Americans are this brutish cowboy type, heavy imperialists, killing people and bombing people, and aren't they cruel and horrible? But we're the more sophisticated Europeans, and we're normative, so it's about human rights, democracy promotion. But the irony is, not the irony, it's almost disgusting in some senses, that normative framework can only operate because the Americans do the hard work of reality. Because ultimately, human existence and global politics isn't characterized by a kumbaya story. If you want peace in a kumbaya story, you have to have big weapons to create a form of deterrence to stop. Invariably, what you're always going to get: extraterritorial imperialism, colonialism, invasion and war. That is the story of human history. How do you stop that? It's not by being nice to people, #be kind or be nice or whatever it is. You do that through having active deterrence, carry a big stick. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. So that's how it happens. So to go back to your original question, the woke dispensation that we see now really rests on a structural framework that was operative up until I'd say about 2015 or so. But the war in Ukraine, the rise of China, the potential flashpoint around Taiwan, the obvious insurgencies, etc., the tumult that we see is really now changing the nature of world politics and the international system away from the American unipolar moment to a much more multipolar international system. Economically, still very, very much American-centric, but there are other major centers of economic power. Militarily, still very American-centric. But nonetheless, the costs of America's strategic superintendence of the global economy, as we're seeing, for example, in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels, costs of constantly doing that on the part of the Americans are now increasingly outweighing the benefits that the Americans get. They're going to turn around and say, listen, Europeans, this is what you're going to have going forward. If Trump gets in, it'll be accelerated. If he doesn't get in, it will still happen, but on a longer time frame. And so the Americans are going to say, look, you guys have got loads of money. You keep yapping about the Americans. You keep, I don't want taking the mickey, shall we say, about the Americans. You're all rich. Ukraine and Russia, that's in your neighborhood, really. You should be taking care of that. That's on your neighborhood. Now, we can help you a bit, but, so in a sense then, what you've got, if you put it in a really crude sense, is you've got kind of security socialism. And the Americans are turning around now and saying, we can't subsidize you anymore. You have to ultimately now, spend your own money and step up to the plate. So the irony is we're now entering into a very, very different international system. Not deglobalization narrative has been slightly overemphasized, but nonetheless we're seeing economic dislocations. We're seeing the Chinese economy go very, very wobbly. In many ways, we're seeing the Russians in Ukraine. We can talk about that if you wanted to, but nonetheless, world politics is undergoing a process where the cost of America's strategic superintendence of the global economy are rising, and the cost-benefit analysis on the part of America's foreign policy elites is out of whack. They're saying, "Look, we need others to step up to the plate." So that will in turn have big implications for European politics and the political and security frameworks of all the major Western powers.
No, at the same time, while our national self-confidence, and it's been called this civilizational moment, means that our belief in ourselves is being eroded from within, not from without.
Absolutely. So that's the other problem here. If we think about it, we talk about the national interest or national security interest, but those interests are themselves emergent from a deeper cultural story. They're emergent from a deeper sense of national identity. In fact, an interest itself is how can you have an interest before you know what you are and who you are? You have to know what you are and who you are before you can have that interest. Ultimately, an interest is emergent from identity. So a lot of this stuff that we've seen from our institutions, our media institutions, our legacy media institutions, our universities, is deeply, deeply indulgent. Because if we have this process of woke deconstruction, if we have this process of overturning the cis-normative, patriarchal, capitalist system, then it's really very incumbent upon the people that are pushing this and the institutions that are pushing it to explain, well, what then is it that you think is going to replace it? What's going to replace this when you deconstruct the state, when you deconstruct national identity, when you denigrate it? What's going to replace it? So essentially, you either have a kind of John Lennon type global international system where we're all brothers and sisters and we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Well, that's potentially one framework. Or we move away from what would arguably be one of the most economically successful systems in human history, which places an emphasis on freedom and human dignity and equality of all before the law. We can get rid of that, and then we replace it with what? What is it? And okay, so how then are you? If we do this, how are you? What are you going to tell the Russians? What are you going to tell Iran? What are you going to tell China? What are you going to tell ISIS? What story Well, if we do this, if we undermine our civilizational self-confidence, if we undermine our sense of self, our sense of unity, if we do this, then what are you going to tell these others out there?
Can I then ask you, in the time that we have remaining, how do we reignite that story, the power of human agency, the power of freedom? Where do you see that light of liberty not being reignited, but perhaps burning brighter into the future? And then what can we do as individuals and as part of a community?
Well, I kind of, on one level, I've always been a very big optimist. I'm not particularly optimistic at the moment, given the nature of British politics. I mean, but so it's not a great story right now. But I just think, number one, I just believe passionately in the basic dignity and human decency, so I think that's a very, very powerful thing. And I think most people that are subject to this stuff and see this stuff constantly pumped into their brains just think increasingly now this is absolute nonsense. They don't buy it. They see it for what it is. And that's why you're increasingly seeing ever more desperate attempts. You know, the regime narratives ultimately are increasingly slipping. It's becoming hard to sustain the narratives.
Don't challenge the narrative. So we will crack down on misinformation.
Exactly. So this is why my next book, I really want to do a book that looks at why the West didn't win the Cold War in many ways, and it kind of follows that argument. You know, we're in many ways we're not a million miles from sort of communist Russia, where you have a regime which enforces ideological orthodoxy. But I think the common decency of people. Then there are centres also. So the Institute of Public Affairs is one, but there are many others amongst the West. We need to talk more. What I say in the UK context too, and something I find very, very frustrating, is the Conservative Party is completely ideologically and conceptually moribund. I don't think it really knows what it is or what it wants or what it wants to do. It's kind of lost. To be in power for 14 years, for example, and to leave the Blairite state and the quango system that we've just on the very basic level of human dignity and democracy, to leave that where it's in place is a strategic disaster.
And as you've said, what a damning indictment of former ministers who've been part of a government for 14 years, then being out of power and then complaining about the situation they have left, that they are responsible for.
Well, and they inherited. So there are various laws that, for example, hardwire a lot of the wokery throughout British institutions. The Equality Act is a classic example of it. It sounds nice, the Equality Act, right? When you look at what it actually does, it mandates wokery throughout public institutions. That was passed in the last 3 months of the Blair government. They've sat on that for 14 years. And not only have they sat on it, they've pumped it up. Theresa May pumped it up even more by doing a kind of absolutely statistically irrelevant and stupid gender pay audit, where essentially you compare cleaners with CEOs and say, if they're out of whack, that it's indicative of some sort of oppression, or gender oppression. Anyway, you can carry on forever. But they've left all this stuff alone. So I think what you need to see also is donors and money and support for small acorns. That's what you need to see. So much money goes, for example, into the Tory party, millions and millions of pounds going to the Tory party. And to what end? What do they spend it on? We have got groups of intellectuals and people that are really trying to fight back in this kind of organic network sense, and scrabbling around for money. They can't get funds, they're losing their jobs, they're being cancelled. So I just think a much more sort of joined up strategic nexus and a diagnostic. This is the problem. These are the key elements, the key problems that we've faced, and these are the key ways in which we overcome this going forward. So I think that there's a whole. I could talk for days about this, but there is a whole range of things that can be done.
And then two final questions, Doug. How are we then to think about this situation and the challenges for the future and the opportunities for the future? How are we to think of that as individuals in the West? And then how are we to talk about that to young people?
Wow, that's a big one. I mean, I think that in terms of individuals, I think that what you to have courage, to become more involved, and to have courage. I've been now more and more active for the last 4 or 5 years in this space, pushing back. And more people are doing it now, but I was, and a few of us were back in the day when it was far more risky. And, so I think I do feel that the cultural tide is changing in terms of, the way people see things. I think that is a part of it. So I think courage is a big part of it, is to sort of have courage, but also to join groups, to get more involved in your local communities, have confidence. Also, there needs to be far more joined up dialogues between organisations like yourself in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Australia. There needs to be a far more sort of dialogue and sets of relationships amongst organisations and individuals to help sort of develop and grow this fight back, this pushback.
Which one can sense is coming, and certainly you'd be aware, for example, of the so-called voice referendum in Australia, the proposal to set up an Indigenous-only body in the Constitution, that when it went to the popular vote was overwhelmingly defeated, notwithstanding it was supported by every elite organisation in the country. When people are given the opportunity to speak, they will speak.
Well, I think that's the key. I think ultimately what we need is a re-democratisation of life. And to sort of join back to everything we've just spoken about, we do have centres of power, executive, legal power, bureaucratic power across the West, which is insulated through various mechanisms from democratic accountability, both at the domestic and the supranational level. And I think if we look at communist China, right? Incredible civilization. There's a distinction between China itself as an incredible, rich, diverse, incredible country in the CCP. The one thing that we used to have, at least we could say confident, is we have freedom. And when you have that freedom, you have human innovation, you have invention, you have human agency and dignity to actualize itself and to drive things forward technologically, economically, politically, culturally, socially. So I think we have to constantly reinforce the value of freedom. If we think about the big, I don't see things left and right. I see things as kind of concentrated authoritarianism, ultimately, on the kind of extreme end, and human dignity and freedom. And I think we need to sort of really switch back to the value of freedom. And that also involves a pushback, but also a conceptual critique and diagnostic of these forms of concentrated non-democratic power, quangos, public sector bodies that need to be opened up, ultimately democratic accountability, and also at the supranational level. We need to reaffirm the value and the primacy of freedom.
And how do we talk to young people about freedom?
Wow. Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I think they will. In a sense, though, you're on a sticky wicket or on the back foot. I think there's a thing called the teenage brain. I think teenage brain, and I was like it myself. You very much see the world in black and white terms. You have absolute moral certainty, and so I think the woke dispensation, the woke cultural ideology speaks to that. When you're very angry, you're very passionate, and so I think by its very nature, younger people, and
you don't know too much yet.
You don't know too much yet, but the usual conveyor belt that you had was the old Churchill cliche: not a socialist or left wing at 20, you have no heart. If you're not conservative at 40, you have no brain. But the conveyor belt, though, to actualize that, to bring that into fruition, usually also involves the making of families, having children, but also having capital. So I think a lot of this stuff also, what we have to think very, very hard about is how we enfranchise young people. You're in Melbourne. I'm originally from London. Housing is a massive issue. If you want people to have a stake in society, young people to have a stake in society, and to make babies and to have children, for social reproduction, then you ultimately need to give people a stake in society. So I think a lot of this is related to culture, but also is related to political economy. We have to think about how we re-enfranchise young people, how they get on the housing ladder, how they have dignity in work, how we re-infuse and recreate those forms of community and social solidarity. So I think there is the cultural element, but there is also the political economy element too. A lot of that does revolve around how we create that material conveyor belt to where we want it to land.
Doug, that is a wonderful note on which to finish a fascinating discussion. Can I congratulate you again, and can I so highly recommend your work against decolonisation, campus culture wars and the decline of the West. Professor Doug Stokes, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.